accounts of past flybys and describes them in what I call man-on-the-street detail. You know, it's like you see a television interview or hear a radio interview, and they're, you know, stick a microphone in somebody's face and go, well, tell us about it. And, you know, that's it. And you hear it raw and uncensored from somebody who actually experienced the event. Mm. When you read the Kolbrin passages and it's talking about the destroyer, which is what the Egyptians called Planet X, or what Zacharias Sitchin calls Nibiru, or what the Atlanteans called Hercules, when they talk about it, the terror that they felt drips off the words. Mm. It is that clear. Another thing that I love about this work is that when you read it, all right, I can tell you, yeah, you know, I get folks and they take pot shots at it and they attack it on this basis or that basis or whatever. And I can tell you, I don't care what the naysayers say, what angle they come from or what they think they're clever about. All of them have one thing in common. None of them have ever read it. Because once you start to read it, you know you're reading something you've never read before. You're reading something that we are incapable of writing today. Because the ancients had an exquisite economy of words. They could say in one paragraph or maybe two paragraphs a message that today we'd have to write, a 200-page book to express. Mm. All right. And when we first came to the Kolbrin Bible, I was the worst skeptic you could imagine. You know, the other guys on our research team, we're all just in Mensa and hanging out. And they're going, you got to read it. You got to read it. I'm getting the letters from Australia. You got to read it. I'm going, what is this? The great Hoochie Coochie shot an arrow in the sky and the evil goddess fell and blah, blah, blah. And the answer came back, Marshall, shut up and read it. You know? Yeah. And I'm like, Marshall, shut up and read it? Okay, I'm going to just take this thing apart. I'm going to really hand you your head now, boy. You challenged me. And, my ego's all flared up. And I'm reading it. I'm a page and a half in. And it literally drops me on my head. It just dropped me on my head and stunned me. Because it talks, in the first book, is a creation book. And one of the things as a geek I have been fascinated with, and this really goes back to my early days when I was a science feature producer for Cable News Network, CNN. And we were covering science topics, and I was anything that had to do with space. I mean, I was just on it like white on rice. And one of the things that was so fascinating for me was the simple question of cosmology. Mm. Is our universe expanding indefinitely so, or at some point will gravity overtake the process and then compress it back into another singularity? Now, to date, this has been an ongoing debate, although it's leaning, as the evidence comes in, more towards it being the case where we just continue expanding indefinitely, that we do not have this reverse effect where we compress back into a singularity and then we can all sit around with Peggy Lee singing, and is that all there is? And I'm reading this, and what the ancients tell us, and keep in mind, at this time, people couldn't see Saturn. It was just another star. They didn't see it as a planet with rings, okay, and moons, all right? And they described the whole process, and what the ancient Egyptians understood and what they explained to us is they said, our universe will continue to expand indefinitely, and eventually it will merge with other universes doing the same thing and to form entirely new, magnificent celestial events. So this is not this we shrink into nothingness and as though we never existed. The message of the ancient Egyptians is that the star stuff of what we are made of never dies. It just combines with other star stuff to create entirely new celestial events, entirely new kinds of life forms that this is an ongoing process of creation that is ever evolving. And it's a beautiful and it's a positive message. And I read this in just one paragraph, and the way they described it was so consistent, so insightful, so brilliant. And at that, Marshall shut up and started reading the book.
So how do you think then that they knew all this? Where did their knowledge come from? Is it just a connection with you know the higher aspects of how the universe is composed and put together, or do you think that they were handed down this knowledge from elsewhere?
You know, that is the question I'm interested in, and I think we always tend to want to find that one thing, you know?
Yeah, of course.
and how often is it just that one thing, right? And I don't think it's that one thing here. I think part of it is what they developed internally. But there's a tremendous amount of research that indicates that this knowledge actually came to the Egyptians vis-a-vis Atlantis. It's older. What we're finding with the Maya is the Maya actually inherited their knowledge from other cultures. And Mayan anthropologists and those who study it are saying, you know, there's even a possibility that we could have had influence in their studies from China and from Africa. Mm-hmm. That seafaring was at a much higher state than it is, than we perceive it to be for those times. Mm-hmm. Well, you have that one side. And the other side of it is that as a researcher, you know, what I have come to realize in all of this is that we're not alone. We've never been alone. We never will be alone. The universe is teeming with life. And there is knowledge. If you can learn how to tap into, you know, the source, if you will, you can do amazing things. You know, everyone heard of Gene Roddenberry. He's the guy that created the very successful Star Trek franchise. He tapped into source. That is how he came up with all these marvelous stories. He tapped into source. It was just not human invention. He went beyond. He had the benefit of, whether you call it God, Yahweh, spiritual guides, what have you, but he tapped into source, the cosmic awareness, if you will. And he drew from that to create it. And he didn't even know he was doing it. He was in a retreat and spent a month living in a dorm house with this other woman who was a psychic. And she explained it to him. And she was on my radio show, Phyllis Schlemmer. And he was like, oh, what are you talking about? You know, and then finally he understood it. And then when Roddenberry not only understood that he had actually, without understanding it, had tapped into source, he then began using that to his advantage, and it made him excited. What Phyllis said is that once he realized he was tapping into source, he instantly knew he'd never run out of stories to tell. He wouldn't be like, you know, we all love Twilight Zone, right?
I do.
And that, you know, I love Twilight Zone. You know, imagine a radio announcer in, you know, whatever. And what happened with him? Okay. Yeah, probably the pace of having to create the stories is what caused his heart attack. And he wasn't tapping into source. He was just a very clever fellow. And so I look at that and I'm going, perhaps it could be alien visitation. It could be ancient history we're completely unaware of. But also it could be because the Egyptians were so spiritually advanced in certain respects that they were able to tap into source and understand this, that they divined this from cosmic creation. And again, when you read the Kolbrin Bible, whether you are reading the ancient Egyptians in the first part, we call that the Bronze Book, or you in the second part, which was written by the ancient Christian Celts, we call the Kol Book. You see their understanding of humanity and our spiritual imperative was so much more focused and so much more advanced